Hello, y'all, and welcome back. It is another race weekend, so we get another review slash preview. That was a long hold of lights. Of course, starting with Singapore and the events that took place here in Singapore. As always, we will start at the highest point of the grid and work our way down, and the highest point of the grid was our race winner, Mr. George Russell in the Mercedes. The weekend did not start all hunky-dory for him. He had a crash in FP1 that cost him a lot of basically the entire session's worth of time running. And usually around a street track, especially one like Singapore, getting familiar with the way the track feels, with the way the car is behaving, and getting your eye in around a circuit is very important. And he didn't really have the opportunity to do that on the Friday. However, he definitely bounced back with a vengeance on Saturday. A phenomenal pole position. In fact, both of his runs in Q3 were good enough for that pole position. Realistically, when I was watching it, when I saw that first lap time come in, it was one of those that looked like, oh, nobody's beating this lap time. And it was going to take a lot. And then he went and beat it himself on his next run. Wasn't by a large margin, but he did absolutely beat that lap time as I'm getting squeezed into the wall here. Thanks, AI. But George Russell, of course, fantastic work on Saturday. And then it came to Sunday and did what he needed to do. Got to turn one before Verstappen, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Red Bull portion. But got to the lead, drove a very good first stint. Did look like he was going to be under a little bit of pressure from Verstappen in the second stint when they were both on the hard tires, but eventually started to build the gap that he needed and drove his way to a very, very good win. The Mercedes looked pretty good on the high downforce circuit, so potentially some good news for them as we start working towards the end of the year. There are a few more, I believe there's a couple more high downforce circuits than there are low downforce circuits. There are mostly mediums, I would think. Mexico's an interesting one because it's technically a low downforce numbers, but you're running the highest wings that you've got. But I digress. Mercedes looked good this weekend. Even Kimi Antonelli, who is continuing to improve and find form. He's still very much that untested rookie. He's got some moments, but I think he's finding the balance between being quick and the risk of being that quick. I think this week he probably swung a little too far towards the being safe side, as he was a considerable margin in pace off of his teammate. But he did have a really good first stint where he held off Leclerc. The second stint where he had to get by Leclerc was less impressive because Leclerc at that point was limping the car around the track thanks to Ferrari things that we will also talk about later. But overall, Mercedes looked good, encouraging signs for them both as driver and team. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and it wasn't fake, just before I sat down to record this, the Mercedes Twitter tweeted out that George and Kimi are both confirmed for 2026. So the contract drama, at least for the moment, has been allayed. Now, of course, we haven't seen any details of how long that contract is for George, but if I had to guess, it's the traditional Toto Wolff 1+1, because I'm sure he still has his eyes on Max Verstappen if that Mercedes car is the best car. Next up, of course, speaking of Max Verstappen, we are on to Red Bull. Now, Max Verstappen turned in the kind of weekend that you expect to see from a Max Verstappen who can smell a championship. It's still pretty long odds, but it's not impossible odds. And he, aside from George Russell, put a pretty competitive lap to go front row. And he went aggressive on the strategy. Chose the soft tires to try and get that launch off the line to get into the lead of the race. It didn't quite work out, but he did well managing those soft tires and keeping that stint going and staying ahead of the McLarens. And most importantly, he drove a phenomenal final stint where he was under lots of pressure from Lando, who was on fairly, I think, 7-lap younger hard tires for the duration, and never had a misstep, never got in his own way, and was able to keep Lando directly behind him, so much so that Oscar nearly got brought into the fray as well. Of course, that all got spaced out in the final couple of laps as lap traffic got interesting for them, but a phenomenal drive from Verstappen, and really did well to gain ground on both of the McLarens, which is kind of all he needs to do is maximize. And as far as the championship goes, the order of the McLarens behind him was what he needed as well to gain the most amount of points possible on Oscar Piastri. Yuki Tsunoda had another pretty anonymous weekend, not making Q3, not scoring points. He also was on that same soft tire starting strategy as Verstappen. He was not able to keep those tires alive as long as Verstappen was, and therefore was kind of just mired in the bottom of the pack. As we get to the final few races of the season, you start to look, I highly doubt that Yuki Tsunoda will be retained in any of the Red Bull seats, whether it's at the main team or dropping back down to VCARB. I would say that's probably not going to happen, especially because he's got, still has that Honda backing. They were willing to release him from those responsibilities, Honda was, if he was going to perform well enough to stay at Red Bull. But I would estimate that Yuki's probably not got any open spot to go to on the grid next year. There's a chance I think he probably ends up as a test and reserve driver for Aston Martin, follows the Honda influence there, but very much likely that we won't see Yuki on the grid next year. Let me scroll, because I believe we are now on to the McLarens. And McLaren has this tendency to, even when they win, to make it feel bad. And McLaren won the Constructors' Championship this weekend. They clinched the points needed. Nobody will catch them. Honestly, it was a really dominant year. I think it was the second earliest clinch of the Constructors by percentage left in season, because there was, I believe, a McLaren team in the 90s that did it slightly earlier on percentage because there was fewer races. But still, as far as the Constructors go, a very strong performance from the team. The reason why I say it feels bad is because there's all of this drama around both the race itself and some drama from the Constructors celebration after. Now, I will say some of this drama is real, some of it is manufactured. The post-race drama of, Oscar wasn't on the podium to celebrate the Constructors with them, that one is explainable. It is explained, well, it has been explained because drivers that don't finish on the podium have required media duties to attend to, and those were happening at the same time that the FIA threw this Constructors celebration together. Hence why Oscar was not there. Which, fine, which I think is a nothing burger. They got together at the garage after all that was done. They had their champagne, had their P1 board, and celebrated the Constructors together there. The other bit of end of race drama is the video going around of, Oscar shut off his radio while Zach Brown was talking to him about the Constructors. going back and looking at the onboards when he's pulled into Parc Ferme, it does appear that he's already well into the shutdown procedure of the car. And most likely that his radio wasn't even connected when Zak Brown started talking, much less had the opportunity to cut him off and hang up on him, so to speak. So I think that's also kind of a nothing burger as well. I do think Oscar is right to be frustrated with the way that the day went for the on-track reasons, which was the contact between Lando and Oscar, where Lando just about put his teammate into the wall, trying to avoid hitting Max Verstappen. So, two issues I have with that there is, A, it's your teammate. You shouldn't be, if you've got to make the choice to hit something, hit not your teammate. Don't cost your team points if you're going to do damage. Just, take yourself and a competitor out. In fact, they probably could have that would have been the end of Max Verstappen's championship challenge if he had a puncture there, I'm sure. But regardless, I think Oscar said it himself best, and once I can look down at my screen for a split second to refresh on the quote, I will read it, because it was Oscar's radio message after they were talking about, fixing it. And it was, if he has to avoid another car by crashing into his teammate, it's a shit job of avoiding. And I agree 100% with Oscar in that situation. Now, to that point though, I think there are things that Oscar could be doing better. I know at early points in the season, I've already been saying Oscar needs to be treating his race strategically like Lando is the only person he's racing on track. Instead of his side of the garage trying to cover off Leclerc by covering an undercut there, treat him like he doesn't exist, because that has netted Lando some solid points. I think it needs to go even further at this point, where Oscar needs to start thinking of Lando as being the only car to worry about when Lando is, in an adjacent position. I think at this point, if they qualify side by side on the grid, Oscar needs to be covering off Lando like he's the only person out there. He needs to be making sure that instead of trying to go around the outside of Verstappen and leaving the door open for Lando to go into, which, to Oscar's point, if you leave the door open for your teammate, you don't expect them to shuffle you into the barriers. Whereas if it was just another car, if it was a Ferrari or something, I'm sure, you don't expect the same kind of kindness to be given from another team. You did expect such from his own team and did not get it. And I think that's the extra frustrating bit. And we definitely learned and saw what Papaya Rules really, really means, which unfortunately appears to be a bit more biased towards Lando. And the reason I say this is Lando didn't really get any kind of telling off on the radio, or was told to swap the positions or anything from this contact. However, Oscar Piastri has been on the receiving end of such radio transmissions already in both Austria and Hungary, when he was chasing Lando for position and attempting to make an overtake and had...
Here's some information on Hulkenberg. Right, they've got a serious car issue. It looks like they're retiring.
Okay. And had lockups. His engineer was quick to be on the radio to say, this is not how we go racing against our teammates. So even when Oscar so much as put a little bit of a scare into Lando, they were suddenly on the radio, oh my God, back off, don't do that. Because Oscar never really reattacked after those moments. He backed off by team order. Whereas apparently Lando can drive into Oscar, gets no such similar warnings or reminders, so to speak, which is a little disappointing. and is just kind of part of the mess that they've made for themselves, especially when you factor in Monza, which, at least from what I've been reading and hearing some transcripts of interviews about, the discussions of papaya rules and what it means. Apparently, according to Oscar, even before Monza happened, things like slow pit stops were to be considered part of the racing, same as racing cleanup. So I think Oscar was already they did Oscar dirty by making that swap because of a slow pit stop in Monza. Especially if what has been reported is true, and it had been said that slow pit stops would be considered part of the racing and not intervened with, because that's definitely happened. So Oscar definitely needs to just treat Lando like he's the only competitor. I believe even if Max wins out, and as long as Oscar comes second every race and is ahead of Lando, I think he's safe. So he just doesn't even need to think of anybody else on the track except for Lando and occasionally Max. But I think going forward, we're going to see a very different Oscar Piastri, who is going to be a little less friendly when it comes to it. And I hope that we see him do what I hope he would do, which is treat Lando like he's the only other car on track. Next up, let's move away from McLaren and on to another team that continues to disappoint, and that is Ferrari. Lewis had a weekend where he qualified ahead of Leclerc, which has been pretty rare. And the outright pace of the Ferraris didn't look too bad. I mean, it was definitely behind the McLarens, the Mercedes, and the Red Bull Verstappen. Verstappen, Red Bull, I can totally talk in the right order. But shortly into the race, they got struck with reliability problems and issues, and Ferrari seems to have had a lot of those this year. This time, it was the brakes and brake cooling. Leclerc did well to put some early pressure on Antonelli, but then his brake issues started, which were slow building. He had brake temperature issues throughout the race from that point on and had to do significant lift and coast. In fact, he was under a massive lift and coast when Antonelli re-overtook him in the second stint, which is, disappointing to say the least. And otherwise drove a decently solid race. Lewis, on the other hand, gambled on the two-stop, drove a pretty strong charge race, was nearly in position to attack Antonelli and try and catch up and make an overtake into the top 5. The two-stop strategy there with clean air did look very quick on those softs, but then had a catastrophic front left brake failure. And then just started falling back. Luckily, the brake failure is only on one rotor or one wheel and with only a couple of laps left to go in the race. But he ended up falling all the way back behind his teammate and lost all the time above the next car on track, which was Alonso. He ended up crossing the line a couple tenths of a second ahead of Fernando, but to add insult to injury and the pain of the failure already, Lewis was given a 5-second penalty post-race because there were some corners where he tried to slow down and couldn't, and just kind of had to cut the corner. And as a result, track limits violation. So definitely a problem for them, and it dropped him behind, because otherwise he drove a pretty solid race overall. The reliability issues significantly impacting Ferrari's ability to even just push at top speed, and I'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about Austin coming up, because I think Ferrari's going to have a problem there. But it is really making them look like 4th best out of the top teams. And they've fallen off from being second in the Constructors. They are not looking very good, and the only saving grace at the moment is that Red Bull has Yuki Tsunoda not really scoring well in the other car. Otherwise, I think Ferrari is very much at risk of ending this year in potential fourth in the Constructors, which would be very bad for them. Hopefully that wasn't audible because that was really loud. Next up, we've got Aston Martin, who, back on a high downforce track, actually looked quite decent again. Now, I believe there was a little bit of glory running going on in practice because both Stroll and Alonso were up in like the top 5 in some sessions. I think there was a little bit of the engine was turned up a bit more than the competitors. But come qualifying day, Fernando Alonso did manage to get that car into Q3 and have a decent qualifying performance. Stroll was not quite up to the pace of Fernando, but drove a very, very long time on a set of soft tires. It was a very interesting strategy from him. And of course, Fernando Alonso drove a solid enough race, was basically best of the rest by a significant margin, and picked up some extra pieces via Hamilton's penalty in the Ferrari. What are you doing upstairs? Okay. So they've definitely rebounded from all the low downforce tracks. I think with more medium and high downforce tracks, I think, you know, Vegas is still going to be a low downforce track. But I think of the ones left, it's primarily mid and high downforce tracks. So it may be giving a little bit of opportunity and some hope for them to finish 2025 with some momentum to lead into the 2026 season, which will be good for that squad. Next up, we'll keep working our way down, is Haas. It's a new week, but a similar story. Oliver Behrman getting into Q3, while Esteban Ocon not even making it out of Q1. And Ollie Behrman continues to look like a very quality driver. I mean, we saw in his kind of reserve appearances for when there was it Carlos out and then one of the Haas drivers out last year, looked very solid and is looking the same here, especially against a pretty highly rated teammate in Esteban Ocon. And not only was it the qualifying result, but Ollie scored 2 points in P9 for Haas, while Esteban Ocon was twice as far back in P18. I totally forgot to pit because I was talking. But yeah, so Haas, I don't expect to bring too many more upgrades at the end of this year. It's not usually their thing. But it's a little bit of a coin flip week in and week out which Haas team you're going to get. Is it going to be the one that is P17 and P19 and looks like they're going nowhere? Or is it the one that is fighting inside the points? Let's go for the race lead here. Huh? Why not? So it should be fun to play that guessing game as the rest of the season progresses. Next up is Williams. They had a pretty modest Saturday turn into disaster as after qualifying with putting both cars in Q2 and qualifying in the middle of the pack, both cars were disqualified. The reason being the rear wing flap was opening too wide when DRS was active, above the 75 millimeters that is allowed. So that resulted in both cars starting at the very back of the grid. Now, Albon and Sainz both drove very strong races, and Carlos managed to get himself a points finish, got all the way back up to P10. Whew, rear end very loose there. Which was definitely supported by some team play in Alex Albon. Both drivers had pretty long stints on the medium tires. Sainz going 50 laps on those mediums. But Alex came in, got a good pit stop timed right, and created a DRS train that held up so much of the grid so that when Carlos would come out, he had time to work with and was able to secure that that points finish. So credit to the Williams team. They've done it a few times this year, playing the team game, and that combination of drivers is working quite nicely together. So I will give them credit. The Williams, starting to look more like itself again in both qualifying and the race, but they've gotten themselves over 100 points, and I think they might have with a couple more points finishes, they may just lock down that P5 in the constructors, that best of the rest, as the chasing pack definitely has some ground to make up. Who do we have next? VCarb, Racing Bulls, whatever you want to call them today. So they look pretty decent overall in the midfield. Pace-wise on Saturday, they looked relatively competitive. Isaac made it to Q3, Liam into Q2, but in the race, VCarb did what VCarb does. They gambled on some strategy, and it really did not pay off. Isaac started on the softs, just like Yuki and Max did. However, his early stop dropped him behind Alex Albon, which is what put him right in that DRS train that he was never, ever going to be able to really escape from. Liam, on the other hand, started on the mediums, went very long, and unfortunately they left him out so long that he was losing 2.5 seconds per lap to the cars around him by the time he came in. So he kind of lost all of the advantage. Essentially, that Albon train caught him before he pitted, and when he came back out, he was just nowhere to compete, unfortunately. So the car still looks decent enough to be fighting in the midfield. It looks, to still have some pace, but it's very on again, off again as far as what the strategy team is gonna put together for the VCarbs, if they are going to have a decent weekend or not, even when they get into Q3. But that's kind of all we have for them. I was going to say but and add something, but that's it. That's all I got. They look competitive. They'll probably be competitive for the rest of the season in that midfield fight, as it is with how close it is. Any wrong step can take you right to the back of the field real quick. Alpine up next. Their down season kind of continued here with both cars out in Q1 and both cars finishing in the bottom 5 of the race. Colapinto had a decent drive comparatively, although it's hard to call it decent when it's P16. The car's just not there, and as mentioned last time, they're just not really looking to do any more upgrades on that car. So I think they're just kind of limping it home this season, waiting for 2026. The only real questions that are hanging over that team at the moment are, what's the driver lineup going to look like next season? Obviously, Pierre Gasly has been signed to a multi-year contract, but that second seat Franco Colapinto is in now, do they chance letting him have another season, or do we think they try and look to the driver market to see if they can get anything? I think it's probably one of the few possible landing spots for Tsunoda if they want a race-ready driver, but Yuki has really not done well with his own stock after moving into the Red Bull seat. Granted, everybody in the paddock knows how much of a pain that Red Bull car is to drive. They saw what Yuki did in a couple of years at VCarb, but still, I think Alpine's got some choices to make. And lastly, this week, we've got Sauber, who was not much to talk about. I mean, Nico finally got back on top of his rookie teammate, got nearly into Q3 while Gabriel Bortoleto was knocked out in Q1. But the Sauber really struggled this weekend. seeming to struggle on the tires, especially in the hands of Gabriel Bortoleto, who came in, started on the mediums, and came into pit on the same lap as Yuki Tsunoda, who was the earliest stopper in the entire race. And Yuki Tsunoda was on the softs. After that, Bortoleto had to do a substantial stint, 48 laps on the hard tire, and his pace was just kind of nowhere after that. Nico Hülkenberg was able to get up into the top 10 in his opening stint, did quite well, but their timing of the pit stop was not ideal as it pitted him into traffic right behind Yuki Tsunoda, and Yuki basically formed his own little DRS train and held up Hülkenberg. Nico gambled on some softs at the end, but at that point he was just too far back to really be any kind of impact in the race. So Sauber as well is kind of one of those teams that's a bit of a coin toss in that bottom 5. Will we see them putting cars in Q3, or will we see them finishing 2 of the last 4 positions? But I think that just about does it for Singapore. Let's jump over to the United States and Circuit of the Americas in Austin and talk a little bit about the upcoming race. All right, so here we are in the pole position grid box for Circuit of the Americas. And looking straight ahead does not do the hill up to turn 1 justice. It is a huge, huge climb up that hill. I haven't looked up what it is, but it is nuts. When you're watching the TV broadcast, if you watch the cameras, if they show from the top of the hill looking down, gives a better sense of scale. But it is one of the more important overtaking opportunities in the early stage of the race when the field is bunched. So let's get off the line here. It's not a hugely long run. The other part is going up the hill, you're able to brake later because, well, gravity's helping you slow down a bit. But so you head up to this hill, and especially for the drivers that are sitting even lower than I am, it is a completely blind entry into this corner. You can see it's a very wide opening to this corner, and then it tightens up here on the right on the exit. So look to see drivers taking to this runoff to avoid various incidents around turn 1. It's always an action zone because it's so wide entering that. I think you can fit like 8 cars across, which is really, really something to see. So that first lap always gets very interesting. Now we'll head down into the sweepers. You really quickly have to get kind of sorted out. It's a very tough area to go side by side through. Aside from the first lap, I don't think you'll often see anybody challenge side by side through these sweepers. Taking inspiration from the Maggots and Beckett's complex of Silverstone, you have this series of S's finishing off with this long, long right-hander. Then you've got another blind crest to come over for this little left-handed pitch before you set up for this turn up the hill. Look for drivers to use this inside curbing to help rotate the car, and then it turns into this quick left-hand flick. As you crest the top of this hill, the rear tires like to go light, so trying to maintain control through an acceleration zone is very, very tricky for the drivers and is an error-generating spot that I've found. Next, you head down the hill. If you can get a little bit of a run, if somebody makes a little bobble out of that left-hander, you do have an opportunity to run down to another very wide entry hairpin turn. Similar to turn 1, but flat. You've got this very sharp angle, very wide entry, narrow exit. Not quite so pronounced as turn 1 is, but an overtaking opportunity, but also a very important zone to get a very good exit from, because then you're headed on the back straight. DRS zone opens right here, so you get a good run of speed, slipstream, long way down, and then you're into the hard braking downhill this time of turn 12. So making sure you get that car slowed down for this left-hander is tricky. We saw incidents with drivers going off wide on the exit of turn 12. Max Verstappen and Lando Norris, rather famously, last season was a big one. Then you work into this really cool little technical section that definitely, tests what the cars got left in the tires. The rear tires are obviously going to be screaming through this zone. And then a really cool double left-hander. You'll typically see the racing line take this wide angle to open up the entry into the second apex on the left here. But in the race, you can sometimes have cars dive to the inside of the first left-hand apex to make that line shorter and get a good opportunity to brake. So it does tighten up the entry to the next corner, but you then get a chance to kind of lunge it and make an attack. So it's one of the non-DRS overtaking opportunities that you'll see on the calendar this year. Then you head to the end of the lap. Not a lot of passing opportunity coming up here. This long triple right-hander reminiscent of Turkey, the track and country, not the animal. And then you have another real tricky blind left-hander. You'll see it as I ramp up the speed. But this penultimate corner is very hard. You'll typically see track limits violations are going to happen here as drivers run out wide and get over the track limits. And then the final corner is this little awkwardly cambered left-hander. The rear tires love to get squirrely around here, and then you're opening up. Here's the finish line, though. So very short run out of the final corner to get to the actual start-finish line, as there's a best lap of 5 minutes and 23 seconds. Well, let's pick up the pace a little bit, and you can see kind of what it is to navigate your way around the Circuit of the Americas track. And while I drive around there, I'll talk a little bit about the tire strategy and what we are looking to see this year. Now, this is another track where they have done some changes to the tire allocations from last year. No, it's not the C6 compound, but what they are doing is they're adding a gap in the compounds, which I think we saw in Australia as the other track where they did it. And they're doing it at the upper end. So we still have the C4 and C3 tires for your soft and mediums. Last year and the year before, the C2 in sequence would be the hard tire. This year, they're bumping it all the way to the C1, which is going to be the more durable tire. Now, I think what they're trying to do is bring a hard tire that is so much slower than the mediums that it pushes it to a two-stop race. I have my doubts. Pretty much everything they've done to try and push it to a two-stop race doesn't work, especially when you have a tire that lasts almost forever like the hard tire does. And they're only giving them a longer lasting hard tire. So that's going to be the interesting portion of the tire allocations. Maybe we'll see more use of a medium soft two-stop, but I highly doubt it. I think we're probably just going to see drivers extend the medium so they don't have to run the hards as long, but still run that one-stop strategy. Speaking of the strategy, in 2024, it was any combination of hard and medium. One-stop strategy was basically the entire grid. I think one person put on softs for like 3 laps at the end that finished P19, so it was not relevant at all. However, in 2023, we actually did see the two-stop strategy, and it was still a mixture of mediums and hards, but it was a two-stop strategy. So possibly on the cards is the two-stop. I wouldn't expect it just with the way we've seen everything else this year. And teams seem to be able to extract performance from the hard tire regardless of which compound it is compared to the medium, and then are basically able to do the entire race. Of course, the safety car could throw a wrench into those plans. An early safety car, you're probably seeing everybody just throw on a set of hard tires and go to the end. A late safety car, that's where it gets a little more interesting, but is less likely because the field is often spread out a lot more. Now, as far as things to watch for in the United States Grand Prix in Austin at Circuit of the Americas, we'll start, we'll go through in constructors order. Obviously, McLaren has clinched the Constructors' Championship, so trying to do things to maximize the team's points, no longer an excuse. I think it now becomes the sole focus of them for the Drivers' Championship. I think Oscar needs a statement kind of weekend. He needs to be ahead of Lando in qualifying, ahead of him in the race. If Lando is trying to do something cheeky, he needs to shut the door and make it known. Because as much as you don't like to talk about it, if it does get marginal, if Lando is throwing moves up the inside somewhere, if both cars retire, it benefits Piastri. It's kind of just the math of it all. Now, I'm not saying Oscar go crash into Lando, but what I'm saying is if Lando's going to put you at risk, put him at risk. So who we got next? Obviously, now in the constructors is Mercedes, and now it's a mid-high downforce track. I think Mercedes has an opportunity to go quite well here. They have in the past, and George Russell's on a pretty strong run of form. I don't know how Antonelli's going to handle Circuit of the Americas, but I think that they've brought kind of gotten back on top of the car. I think it's looking to be a decent contender. Not for race wins every week, but it is going to be something that could get in the mix and trouble the cars around. Next up is Ferrari, and I know I said I would talk about their reliability issues from Singapore. One of the crucial problems that Ferrari has been fighting all season is the inability to run the car very low and falling afoul of plank wear rules. Circuit of the Americas is not a very smooth circuit. The land it's built on is a little bit sinky. So there are constantly bumps being created in this circuit. And I think that's going to be a big problem for Ferrari, much in the way that they had to take the DSQ in China because of the plank wear. I think they're going to be in a fair bit of trouble when it comes to plank wear here in Circuit of the Americas. I think in the sprint week, forgot to mention, a sprint weekend, so even less time to get the cars set up and dialed in. But I think, much like China, you may see the Ferraris have an opportunity to do well in the sprint, and then it just won't translate to the Grand Prix. There's that track limits I was talking about, because they won't be able to stay inside the plank wear rules. Who do we got next? Red Bull. I'm going to say it like every week, Yuki Tsunoda needs the kind of week that says he belongs. He's gotten more confident with the car, for sure, but it was mostly in those low downforce tracks. We're still on a higher, definitely on a higher downforce configuration than Monza and Baku, and in a high downforce configuration of Singapore, he didn't look that great compared to Verstappen. He was quite a ways off the pace. So I'm not holding my hopes particularly high for Yuki. On the other side of the garage, Max Verstappen, he's in win out mode. If he wants this championship, he basically has to win every race, and he performs well when that's the case. He's had some very good performances at Circuit of the Americas. He knows his way around the track quite decently. So I would put Verstappen, especially in the way the Red Bull car is now starting to come alive, I would put him very firmly in could probably win this race category. So keep an eye out for Verstappen on Friday, how he's feeling about the car, and how he looks with only the one practice, and how he starts to look in the sprint qualifying. Next up, we've got Williams. That's right, best of the rest, the car we're currently sitting in. Williams is a bit of an unknown to me at this point. We'll see if they bring some upgrades. I think they're still trying to bring upgrades to the car. to try and secure that P5 in the constructors. They're not quite focused 100% on 2026 like some other teams are. But it's, you know, Carlos Sainz has typically done pretty decently around here. And Alex Albon is, you know, never a driver to count out. I think the Williams is in a fairly balanced spot at the moment. It's for medium downforce tracks like this one. So I think they're, you know, they could threaten Q3. I would say they've got a good opportunity for it. VCarb, I mean, flip a coin for VCarb. They've been looking really good. They've looked really bad. They've scored points when they've looked bad. They've not scored points when they've looked good. I think it's really more about that teammate battle between Lawson and Hadjar. I think this is essentially, these closing races are the audition for the Red Bull seat at the start of next year. I think Red Bull is willing to give Liam that second chance. I think they understand they moved him up too early and pulled him out of the car without really any chance to prove himself. So I think, you know, he's still definitely in the mix. And Isaac Hadjar has looked very good this season in performing against both Tsunoda and Liam Lawson. So look for the teammate battle to really develop, less so than the points paying, you know, where they finish in relation to the points, but where they finish in relation to each other is the storyline. Aston Martin, they're starting to turn around. I think Fernando Alonso has an opportunity to threaten Q3. Lance Stroll, he's a bit of a wild card. Sometimes he's looked really good this year, other times not so much. And he's coming off of a race in Singapore where I just don't think he was necessarily given the best opportunities to succeed with his strategy, even with the qualifying pace deficit. The Aston Martin is looking a modestly handy car. Sauber looks to have been taking some steps back in the last few races, not both strategically and just how the car is performing. Gabriel Bortoleto, I think, is going to look to get back on top of Nico Hülkenberg's qualifying performances again. It's the kind of track that rewards those young, quick reflexes. But Sauber, maybe threatens with Q3. I have pretty low confidence that they'll be threatening with Q3. I think it's slightly more likely they're a Q1 exit than a Q3 participant. Next up is the Haas team. They're bringing a special livery to Circuit of the Americas. It is a home race, so you want to see him do well. I think Esteban Ocon needs to do well. He's kind of having a season to forget. I think if he can finish the last, 5 races off in strong fashion, I think he can restore some of his lost, what's the word I'm looking for? Lost credit? No. Well, whatever. You know what I mean. His lost status, considering he's been losing to Oliver Behrman so frequently. So it's an important end of the season for him. I don't know what Ocon's contract looks like, but he could be in trouble come the next renewal period if he does not step it up. And lastly, we have Alpine, which Alpine is Alpine. They're not bringing upgrades to the car. I mean, Pierre Gasly still will occasionally get involved in the chaotic race. We don't often see chaotic races around Austin, so we'll have to see. Oh, and final note about Austin and the strategy. It is a track where you can overtake. It's not impossible to overtake around the Circuit of the Americas track. And we have seen in the past, in the old regs, in the 2020, 2021 and before cars, the mix of the one-stop, two-stop, where if there's a clean air to pit drop into, then you can probably go for the two-stop to try and get a tire offset to get ahead of somebody. But if you're pitting and having to work your way through traffic, I don't think the two-stop's there. So we'll really have to look and see how the field spreads in the sprint to get an idea for what the strategy in the Grand Prix might be. But that's all I have to say. I'm sure it was a lot to say and a lot of nothing to say. But thank you all for joining me. Hopefully you find it informative as always. Any questions, let me know in the comments. And I'll either reply in the comments or talk about them in the next video. But I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.